Welcome back to the Old Shot. Today we're talking about the first three cameras I ever used, including the first two cameras I ever bought. And I don't have any of those three cameras anymore, but we'll go into more detail on each of them as we go along. The first camera I ever used was a Kodak Box Brownie. I believe from looking at photographs it was a number 2 Model F, which was made early to mid 30s. How it came into the family I can only guess. It would have been passed down from grandparents to my parents, and one day as 9 or 10-year-old I announced to my mother that I wanted to take photographs. So they bought me a film, we loaded up the Box Brownie and I ran a film through it. I only ever ran one film through it, and I only have one photograph still surviving from that roll. But some details on the camera first. It took 120 film and it was 2 1/4 by 3 1/4 inch size negatives. It had 2 viewing windows for either portrait or landscape, and you had to arm the shutter with a small lever before pressing the shutter release. Although I don't remember this, apparently it had 3 apertures. It might be why my first film that I ever took wasn't that successful, and might be why I've only got one photograph surviving. But I'm going to show you that photograph now. It's not brilliant, it's not very sharp, probably suffering from camera shake too. This is it, my first ever photograph from the Kodak Box Brownie. Some years after I took that photograph, I started my working career. Became an apprentice in a glass factory, and one day on the way from work I was passing through Newcastle and there was a photographic shop, and I decided to have a browse. I was interested by all these shiny toys in the window, all these cameras, and I thought, if I buy a camera I can become a good photographer. So I went in, had a look around, made a very considered choice in that it was the only camera that was under £10. I bought a Halina Paulette. It's a 35mm compact made in Hong Kong. This camera had a fixed lens. It was a Halina Anastagmat 45mm. It had apertures that ran from 2.8 to f/16. It had 4 shutter speeds, a 30th, a 60th, a 125th and a 250th, plus the B setting. It had no focus aids other than the scale in feet around the outside of the lens. It had no exposure aids whatsoever, no light meter, and anyway, I bought this. I didn't know anything about hyperfocal distance or Sunny 16s, and for my exposures I used the information sheet that came with the film, which I understand was based on Sunny 16s. My success to failure ratio wasn't very good, and I used the camera quite a bit for 3 or 4 years, from about 1973 to 1976-77. On the camera, the Halina Anastigmat lens, I would rate that as heap of caca. It wasn't very good, it wasn't very sharp, it wasn't very contrasty. But here's some of the photographs that I got out of it. We'll see what you think of that. So after a few years of using the Halina camera, even I recognised its limitations, realised it wasn't a great camera, and I started looking for something a bit more serious, and I eventually decided on the Zenit EM, which is a Russian camera. I believe the EM was made from the early 70s through until the early 80s. It was a 35mm SLR camera, and it seemed like a big step forward for me. So after the Halina, it was, yeah, now we're talking. The first thing anyone notices about a Zenit camera when they pick it up is they're very, very heavy. I've got two Zenits here. This is the Zenit E, made from 60s through until 80s, and I've got a Zenit TTL. The Zenit EM would fit in this space here. It came between that and that, but they're all basically very similar. Heavy, very heavy. So the Zenit EM had a built-in uncoupled meter like this. It's got selenium cell window here, which read off on a little slit here. There's a little pointer goes up and down the corner of the light, and there's a needle with a eye on it. You centre that over the pointer, and then you can read off exposure, shutter speed and f-stops off there. Put your f-stop chosen on there, change your shutter speed here, and click, away you go. The advantage of the Zenit EM over the Zenit E was that it had a little bar here, which when you're pressing the shutter, the bar moves forward and presses a pin on the lens, which closes down your aperture before the shot's taken. And so on the Zenit EM, after you put that in, wind it on, click, the aperture closes down, the photograph's taken, and it opens up again. So it makes it nice and bright for focusing before the aperture is closed down. On the Zenit EM, it's the same as this really. It's got the same shutter speeds. Goes from a 30th of a second up to a 500th of a second plus the base setting. It's the scale for setting your ISO or ASA, or in this case the Russian Ghost, which is roughly but not exactly equivalent to ISO. It runs, the fastest film that you can measure for is 500 Ghost, which really is about 400 ISO. If you had a faster film you could work around it, but the readings are for films of that speed. So what you would do is you'd load your film in, close the back, wind it on one, and then you'd set this, there's a little arrow there, bring it round to 0. So when you go out, the first time you wind it on, click it, that's a lost shot, and then you set up for number 1. If you ever get one of these cameras and you're setting your film counter, always turn it anti-clockwise, because I find that if you turn it to 0 going clockwise, after you've wound it on the first time, goes to number 5 or something like that. So always go anti-clockwise. In the viewfinder on the Zenit EM, it has a Fresnel lens, which basically, your screen is like a matte screen, and in the middle are 2 circles. The outer circle has like a fine microprism crisscross thing, and in the centre is a coarser microprism crisscross, and basically you turn your focusing until you get a sharp image in the centre, and that's your focus. Not quite as quick as the split prism that you get on more modern SLRs, but I find it's a system that works, and it works accurately. When I got the Zenit EM, the first SLR camera, it did encourage me to be experimental, adventurous, and some of my photos that I've taken, which I'll be showing now, show that I was prepared to try things a bit out of the box. I had some friends who were in a band. I took some photographs of them for their portfolio. Worked quite well. Not a professional course, but I was a young lad trying things out for the first time. So we'll have a look at them photos now. So there we go, that's the first 3 cameras I ever used. The first 2 cameras that I bought, the Halina Paulette and the Zenit EM, I think they demonstrate that the first 2 cameras that you buy for yourself are the ones that bring you on in your photography. The Halina Paulette, I learned quite a lot from it, mainly through failures. Eventually I got to understand something about exposures, and I started getting a better success rate. Focusing, I still really didn't know about hyperfocal distance. If I'd known that, I would have had a lot more sharp photographs, but sharp is a relative term when you're talking about the Halina lens. It wasn't a sharp lens. And then when I got the Zenit, I think that really set my creative juices flowing, within my own limitations of course, and I learned a lot through experimentation with the Zenit. It was a good camera, heavy camera. The lenses on Zenits are great. The Helios 44M lens, which is this lens here actually, goes from f2 to f16. Focuses down to 1/2 meter, and it's got a long throw of course from infinity to 1/2 meter, but the lens characteristics are excellent. That's why so many people now use these lenses on mirrorless digital cameras, because they like the quality it gives to their shots. So there we go, we'll move on now, we'll end that there. That's what I did early in my photographic, I'll not call it a career, in my photographic journey. Thanks for watching. Please like, please subscribe, and I'll see you for the next instalment. Bye.